All right, welcome everybody. It's November 14th, and we're in Cohort 4, first discussion on Chapter 10. So, who wants to begin with some thought or question or any reflection about 10? Anyone can raise their hand or just go for it, but what they thought 10 was going to be, or some component of what they remembered of it, or just some quote that we could start with, or a question that they already wrote.
Sure. I mean, just kind of at a cursory glance at this chapter, it's just they're basically going through a variety of other fields that may or may not be related to active inference and kind of comparing and contrasting. I think it helps to understand what um, kind of trend or body of knowledge in which active inference has its roots, or where it's starting to assert itself as a distinct field. um, it's interesting learning a little bit more about, for example, the Helmholtzian view of unconscious inference as being like one of the key underpinnings of active inference here. uh, Seeing more on the Bayesian brain hypothesis and reinforcement learning and other fields that we see mentioned through the textbook, but it's here that we get like a direct kind of comparison. And in addition to that, I think one of the key overarching themes that they're trying to make is that active inference combines a variety of kind of traditionally separate or separated cognitive functions like perception, action, planning, attention, and so on. Thus, the title of the chapter is "Active Inference as a Unified Theory." Makes a lot of sense. So.
Nice, very nice.
So there's something about the textbook overall that I found myself wondering about when I was reading chapter 10, which is that there are many places in the book where it's not really clear if we're talking only about how the human brain functions versus how cognitive systems function. And so there are places where it's almost it feels like a tease. Like let's explore. This is not just about the human brain. This is about other cognitive systems. But I think for people who the uninitiated, and of course I'm one of those people at the moment, but it's tough, right? Because I've created certain expectations about looking for how does this generalize to all kinds of cognitive systems. But then in the last chapter, the focus is, and the wording is used for the rest of the chapter, it's almost like we're going to introduce these concepts like you would for a psychology textbook. And so they, those various terms that are used in psychology are addressed, and how do we think about them from an active inference point of view. Then this section on social and cultural mechanisms, I think, needs to be either deleted or completely rethought. So when I kept going back to the figure in chapter 1, I think it's figure 1.2, where it has the high road and the low road. And in the center, it has active inference and it has autopoiesis and niche construction. Well, autopoiesis and niche construction are brought up very infrequently throughout the textbook. And I think there's an opportunity for chapter 10 to go back to autopoiesis and niche construction. And there are articles out there that I'm finding fascinating on the wording. I'm still learning new words, but what is this one called? Joint agent. I love this article by Ruenberg. I don't know if this is the one that's cited in the book. It might be, but joint agent environment systems. And I think that that's the place where really cool stuff can be laid out for people who want to take this framework into the social sciences and anthropology.
Thank you. Any other like thoughts on 10 or overall, whether it's someone's like first time at 10 or repeating?
Well, I have another thought, and I'm curious as to how others, feel about this observation. I don't know yet where I would suggest to include this somewhere in the book, but if most of the information that's presented in the book is backed up by data that's been gathered about the human brain, then I think it would be interesting to point out that the human brain is actually a very new centralized nervous system in the history of living organisms. And it's probably between 100,000 and 35,000 years old, meaning that the present day, the modern human brain organization presumably reached that point about around that time, 100,000 to 35,000 years ago. So what I think is super interesting is that the human brain, that's such a recent development, has unveiled so much interesting information about the ways in which we navigate the world and as sentient systems, whatever that means, right? And so that needs to be, I think, very clearly stated somewhere in the book. What do we mean by a sentient system? But anyway, I just thought I would bring that up and ask you others, like, what do you think of that observation?
Anyone can go, or I'll give a thought. Andrew, go for it.
Sure. I want to see if I understand the question properly, but I mean, for me, I think, for example, looking at the human brain and neurobiology, looking at cortical microcircuitry, for example, finding a relationship between that and message passing, the kind of things we find in like chapter 5 in the book. I mean, I think it's very I think it's very interesting. I think it's fruitful, and I think that there have been empirical studies that are being done. And of course, one of the biggest tricks is like to see like how, like, given we're external observers, we have to kind of see how the data behaves and figure out what is a reasonable proxy in the data for what's actually going on in the brain. So I mean, I find a lot of validity in at least attempting to kind of make this connection between like the brain, however new it is, and maybe not just the brain itself in terms of its circuitry, but also like inferential processes, trying to understand how those function in the brain, or applying that as a kind of metaphor or analogy for looking at potentially entire societies, although that's an area of that's the kind of work in active inference that I'm less familiar with, so I don't want to overspeak on that. Um, I don't know if that was like a like a you know, one-to-one like relevant response to your question. So I'm just, yeah, I'm happy to keep talking about it if I understand you.
Yeah, I guess, so I guess what I'm trying to appreciate, like, I don't really have anything super compelling to say other than to note or make the observation as context for this book, I think, is that the first centralized nervous systems showed up in the evolutionary record, I think, about 570 million years ago. And the book is about sentient, cognitive, sentient systems. Presumably, and so I had to do some digging and think, well, are we talking about centralized nervous systems that emerged 570 million years ago? And then, from that perspective, then I marvel at the fact that, humans have this incredible engine that evolved very recently, and yet it has the capacity to not just do everything that's in, I'm completely sold and believe in the whole active inference framework at this point. I just think it's just revealing so much that I have no information about. But I find it super interesting that this brain can actually externalize our generative models, and that we can look at those generative models, and that's why we can do science, right? And so it's not so much that I think it makes the work less valid because we are such a recent development in evolutionary history, but rather how these processes phenomenally led to this brain that can do not only what, being able to contemplate and think about our generative models, but to actually create generative models through artificial intelligence. And that is something about this book that's an insight that can come out as one of a really important aspect of the book somewhere. So that's what I'm trying to convey.
Thank you. Yeah, these are great points. Here's a figure we often return to in this path integrals paper. So it was like absent literature until it was drawn, showing the continuity of the basal cognition and the different types of things. And so, yeah, there's that historiosity of the timeline of when did the enabling aspects that enabled this theory to be developed, or any technical apparatus. And then there's the fact that the subject matter or system of interest of this framework, or any cognitive modeling framework, is the mind/brain etc. There's some fundamental aspects to that reflexivity. There's a lot of it brings everything, it opens up a lot, which is why, and so I think this is a really important point that you're bringing up. Like, do we approach the book is what it is. 2022 textbook can never be changed. They could release a different version. We could generate a massive amount of educational material and develop an ecosystem around this open source textbook, etc. So it's not about changing, from how I see it, what that book is, but how it is approached and conveyed could run the gamut from an extension to a statistics course, ranging to including deeper investigations, like you brought up, of the longer arc of sentience, and just allowing that to open more and into slower, different regimes of attention.
Yes, in this framework, Daniel, where does context come into play in a formal way?
What does anyone think? Where does context come into play?
I'm sorry, I want to make sure I understand the question again. This is context in the form of, do you mean as far as like active inference and behavior goes? Or do you mean the field itself? Like its context?
Okay. I mean, let's go back to the figure 1.2, where, it's the high road and the low road, where in this world does context come into the science?
There's probably a ton of answers, but one short, narrow answer is self-organization, or just broadly the partitioning or differentiation that allows us to say self versus non-self, or just any kind of continuation. That's the context. That's the niche. So the first particular partition that enables us from not being able to say anything about that thing not existing, to it being a thing, it comes into description as contextualized. Another related point is this as if instrumentalist view, that it doesn't take on needing to provide an account of how whatever context is applies to the rat in the maze. So that's why it centers potentially that self-reflexivity of the observer, because the model, not to say it's boring, not to say it's simple, but it's just an artifact resulting from a different process.
Yes. Okay. But when you're talking about something like, how do I want to ask this question? So you use the word artifact. I'm just going to stick for now with the idea that artifact in figure 1.2 is applicable across all sorts of contexts, across all kinds of agents. And I think what I would like to know is where is the, I shouldn't use that word, but where's the boundary? I was going to say Markov blanket, I'm not going to use it, but where's the boundary? In other words, in what systems does this artifact is it not applicable?
Yeah, very common question about the applicability or the scope of this type of modeling.
And so if it's left as an open question, that's okay. And I won't, push any further, but it's really been.
Does anyone want to give it a thought?
Yeah, I can give a thought, and I'm in cohort 5, so I'm just I guess piggybacking off this. But I think that one of the active inference is a model of understanding really any natural system that you want to look at that behaves under the certain dynamics. It could be applied to just about anything. So the context is really going to be up to the person using it. So you could have any context and try to draw the boundaries anywhere. And how you draw those boundaries is going to determine what the organism or particle that you're looking at is and what the environment is. So I think that's one of the cool things about active inference is it's so broadly applicable. And where you draw those boundaries makes all the difference in how the models turn out.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
One note on this is figure 1.2 is not a formal argument. It's more evocative. So these different terms might apply in different ways to different systems, like planning as inference. Not all systems plan. And then even, again, pulling back to the instrumentalist layer, you don't have to model the system as planning. But maybe you do model even an inanimate system as doing some kind of extended planning or vice versa. So they're not requisite. They're just some train stops on the low road and the high road. And I think that is a layer that does kind of make sense to pull back to. Not that this is exhaustive or a panacea, but it's just a framing that helps organize the book and the work, and also situates active inference at the intersection between actually building something from the ground, like what Dennett might call the cranes approach, and the tethering or the association to the high road principle, the skyhook, in that same kind of Dennett metaphor, so that there's something that it can be realized with real software tools and real relationships between the math and the theory and the implementations, finding new useful through and throughs, and therefore having nothing to say about any given thing by virtue of being applicable to any modeling situation. Bronwyn?
Yes, Daniel. I was just the figure 1.2. I view it as you said, sort of a not a fixed thing, and not really a pathway thing, but in ways a lot of those things were historical developments in the way people, scientists and philosophers, were considering the progression of understanding of the sentient being, or we'll use human being, in its environmental niche. So that sort of constant question of how is it that we persist, how is it that we survive, what is it that we do, how do we adapt? And I keep going back, and I was talking to you before about 10.3 and Daniel Dennett's comment in 1978 about necessity to really model the whole iguana, which is really about how do we understand the human being as a whole. And so there's a lot of, and I also, there's a distinction, I think, between this conversation on modeling something and a conversation on understanding the adaptive dynamic nature of an evolving creature in its environmental niche. So in a way, I sort of separate out those things, because the modeling sort of the acting on the consideration of how it is that we continue to survive or not survive, whatever it might be. So I mean, so one thing I think that I've learnt in my travels through active inference is its connection historically to a lot of thought from a lot of people and a lot of consideration of what we do, how we do it. And that's including our sort of evolving ability to be cognizant of ourselves and understand how we are actually making decisions. So it's that stepping back out of our precisions, actually enabling us to fine-tune our own Bayesian mechanics so that we can actually see ourselves clearer in our environments so that we can then function to survive and make better choices. And then we can begin to sort of model that, I suppose. But I always have a question, I'm rambling on a bit, but I always have a question about someone creating a model when they actually have a biased view of, which is the nature of it, a biased view of what they're doing. So I think it's the distinction needs to be made between the actual what the free energy principle states, which is we must reduce or minimize free energy, and the actual process theory of active inference, in which we bring that into pragmatic play in our lives as a whole being in our niche. And then wrapped in that is then, I think we can then subsume all of those other questions that arise. Whatever I just said.
Wow.
But anyway, reaching back to 1.2 is that, I mean, if you go into each of those different areas, autopoiesis, predictive coding, blah, 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 you know, they've all got a sort of a progressive, historical, evolutionary type footing on which I think active inference rests. And I even found another person in America that I was going to speak to about Albrecht Ames. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but yeah, there's like a, you know, it's as if as a whole being we're evolving to be able to recognize ourselves and what we do in our niche. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Evidenced by the perspectives people bring, the skills that are required, the kind of collaborations that would entail skillful usage, a lot of different aspects to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of like one of the follow-ups after the scope question, is it applicable to any given system? And it's like, well, the question presupposes if it's a system that someone's thinking of, then yeah, that's the system. Yeah. Just go ahead and describe it. So people try to hold that out like as if it's going to rug pull the talk. Well, it could apply to everything. It's like, yeah. And then from there, the natural question is like, well, then what does it do? And the whole iguana, it's funny because people make what they believe are justified true belief assertions about human behavior, and this molecule does this. And it's like, not to say that smaller brains are simpler. Of course, I'm always bringing up the insect brains here, but think about how many experiments go into determining the role of like a neurotransmitter at a certain synapse. And so it's like way less evidence in humans, obviously important, everyone cares, but then to overstate the precision, we're not even at the whole iguana. This is the whole chapter 7 T-maze. It's like, that is the whole in what it is. It's a pedagogical example. And then by iterating with a real animal in the maze, then there's more and more, and also it becomes clearer and clearer how the map's not the territory. From the first draft to the 1 millionth draft, map's not the territory. Under whatever constraints the map and the territory co-evolve under. So these are the questions that help make chapter 10 actually about connecting the dots and about anything more than just a literature review on psychological and philosophical topics.
And actually, so when you brought up the word bias, right? Now, would it be a correct interpretation of generative models to say that I think active inference, one of the implications that seems to make sense to me is that we are constantly in the process of creating biases. Because by creating biases, you could say that a bias is just a model in our heads of the world. And in science, we're constantly coming up with these models, but then we get a chance to discuss them and put them at risk. But that's just kind of an example of how powerful I think the power of this perspective, that it actually allows me to think about something like bias that we talk about all the time, and not just, well, it's just bias. Well, what is bias?
I'd like to read a little section from a short piece that I wrote. So basically, active inference learners often look at representations such as figure 4.3 from the 2022 textbook, or figure 1.2, or figure any of the textbook, seemingly expecting to find sophisticated phenomena such as affect or narrative reflexivity in or on that representation. Two key aspects of my response in that situation. First, if active inference were to include even relatively simple cognitive phenomena, learning or attention, in its essential particular formulation, particular partition, this would explicitly restrict the scope of analysis to systems of that character and silently diminish our capacity to distinguish across that difference. Second, natural language or conceptual descriptors of cognitive phenomena are secondary attributions better understood as relational rhetorical assertions using a pattern language of phenomena about a given realized generative model rather than fundamental or intrinsic aspects of the system of interest itself. Not to be verbatim, but I think it's a really important point. Like, bias has a narrow technical definition you'll see in a statistics textbook. It's what biases the data and does anything different than a pass-through. It's just a feature of how discriminatory a signaling algorithm is. And then, of course, there's broader senses and alignments with broader usage of those terms, just like with so many of the terms in the ActInf ontology. And I think it's relevant that, especially when talking about the broader systems of interest or the phenomena, that they're not the basal low road. They're not the assertion. They're not what actually implements the system. They're descriptors of systems with observers, which is the setting where more can be done, and it's a better discussion setting when it's assertion based. Not to like not to go too hard on this one point, but I think that puts the space as us as generative model interpreters in between us and any created artifact. Without that articulation, we're just not set up to have a productive epistemic conversation.
Thought on that, and I like that quote that you showed, Daniel, about the comment of the vagueness and difficulty with philosophical questions is intentional so that it's a generalizable model. We don't want to be pigeonholing it. But I think bias, and this is my perspective on it, is a part of the learning process. And if you're learning anything that you hope to be generalizable, then when it's accurate, it was useful information. And when it's in a situation where it's not accurate, then we call it bias. And anytime you're trying to generalize something, you are creating a bias that you hope is going to be helpful and useful at some future point. But as soon as it gets out of that context where it's helpful and useful, we just call it bias. It's skewing your understanding in a certain way.
Yeah, that's very important. Like, if someone says that was a biased decision, I think, like, how could they violate this or that? But if it was like, no, they picked up on subtle cues, it was a biased decision. be like, wow, great for them in that situation. So what is really the discussion? Not even to that topic, but just that's stepping back from even our words and our symbols. How does that really play out? We're learners on that, all with each other in the textbook group. There is a technical part to ActInf, but I think conversations like this, chapters like this, they show it's not simply that way. The whole low road could be ripped out and replaced potentially. Even in the message passing live stream right now with Magnus Kudal, like generalized free energy generalizes variational free energy and expected free energy. So those are some of the main topics we talk about, like equation 2.5 and 2.6 in this textbook. But if those formalisms last for several years to decade, then they'll have been long-lived even by things not accelerating standards. So there's just a lot of interesting pieces, like as the textbook recedes, then do we continue to drive back to the 2022 textbook? Do people want spaces of more open, straightforward? I don't know. Something in between, all of the above, of course.
Personally, I need more time to think about that. I'm still, there's so much in the book that I still want processing and learning.
Like that's kind of the funny joke at the end of the book. Making the extra curricular claim that active inference is not something that can be learned purely in theory.
That's why it's such a great, I love that about it, because honestly, as I read, I have to pause and then step away and think about how does this apply to this system, that system, other stuff I'm thinking about, and then I come back. But I'll just share with you guys that so I've been studying Buddhist psychology for decades, and one of the things that it's really mind-blowing to me is how the very high level Buddhist psychology scriptures are have very much to do with active inference. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just thinking about applications and then going back to the ideas, digging deep and trying to master very complex concepts and then stepping away.
But Bronwyn?
That's can I just ask a question? Did you just say with the Buddhist psychology that that active inference was congruent? Seems to make sense of a lot of the philosophy. Was that what I heard?
Well, I'll give you a specific example. So for example, so in the so Buddhist psychology is also very applied. It's very abstract and very applied. And so one of the applications is meditation. So what is meditation? What do you do with your mind when you're meditating? And essentially what you're doing is putting at risk all of your generative models. That the way that you find the idea behind that you know, it's called investigating your mind. It's not, you know, if you have a horrible thought about killing somebody, you know, it's not that you just say, oh, no, stop that thought. It's examining, why do I have that thought? And then you ask yourself that. But to me, as I was reading about active inference, is about, yeah, we create these generative models. Like, since I'm an anthropologist and I worked on these different cultures, I mean, I've lived in cultures where people will say, we men can kill women and not be punished. Okay, well, that's a model that these people carry in their minds, right? And so in Buddhist psychology, it's what is the default kind of tape player that's going on in your mind that's driving everything that you do that you never think about. And that's what it is. It's very simple. And it's very consistent with active inference.
Glad you think so. Yeah, there's like several articles and lines of research with like attention, meditation, Buddhist psychology, different knowledge traditions. So that's definitely very interesting. Bronwyn?
Yeah, well, because the reason I ask is that I am an Alexander Technique teacher, which most people wouldn't know what that was. But the Alexander Technique has a history, but it goes back in time to, say, 100 years ago with John Dewey, who was an educationalist philosopher in America. And I think it was stated once on this book club that, you know, Dewey's language now is quite relevant, and particularly if you read it from an active inference perspective, and that's what I have been doing, and as well with the Alexander Technique, and it doing that, having that view, or that, so it's maybe it's a preference that things seem to have much more meaning and are much clearer to be able to understand. That was just one point. The other thing about biases was, I was just wondering, is that sort of discussion about bias within the basic mechanics? We have preferences, and preferences are what keep you where you are. And for me, preferences are biases within the precision mechanics, pretty much in there. And because it's an unconscious inference is pretty much unconscious unless we do something like meditate or pay attention, investigate, then it remains unconscious. But we probably have the ability to cognitively delve a certain degree. There's a certain penetrability to be able to, that's what Jacob Howie talks about, penetrability to be able to actually investigate a little further into our unconscious inferences, to be able to begin to understand why we think something. But then a step on from there is that a generative model is made up of an action perception cycle. And it's just a comment, I could be my preference, that a lot of discussion tends to, in book club, tends to, and even within the broader literature, remain in a sort of a passive state, in a perceptive state, without the recognition that there's an inseparability of action and perception, which I think is what's at the basis of active inference. We cannot separate the two, so that with anything we think or do, it is a perception and an action. And I think it's much more expansive than people's conceptualizations of how we actually function in the world. A lot of our actions are unconscious, when their habits are habitual, when really not present to what we're doing. Meditation and mindfulness meditation, Buddhist meditation, is one method of beginning to investigate that action perception loop that enables us to function at every minute of the day, really, as well as what I consider the Alexander technique. The Alexander technique in its true form brings action and perception and thinking together, so that it's based on a psychophysical re-education process. But I just wanted to put forward, I suppose, that the whole body seems to get broken up a bit in these discussions, and the action perception cycle is that it's an entwined, inseparable functioning. And I think the ability for us to really cognate that, to really sort of understand that, is what active inference hopefully will, and I think is bringing to light. It's the thing that draws people to it. But preferences, not biases. Yeah.
One interesting point there to seal that point is internal and external is just pick a side, but sense and action are identically considered by across any boundaries. Like, and also I find it interesting that the mu for internal state, it is almost like if you rotate this like clockwise or counterclockwise 180 degrees, that it's like it looks like the symbol on the other side, to just show that there's kind of like a mirroring, but not an equivalence. But that's the interface that enables there to be that. Andrew?
Sure. I just wanted to speak on I'm a practicing Buddhist and meditate regularly, and have had a lot of thoughts about this, although I haven't gone too deep into the literature on active inference and meditation. But I very much agree with this idea of meditation as a kind of like practicing one's attention, paying attention to one's thoughts, whatever is going on internally. A lot of forms of meditation involve reading the body, and so practicing interoception, and with that, there's a kind of I don't know, almost like an attempt at overcoming something like habit. Like, I'm getting back into the models, like you have your E matrix versus G, and I think by being able to have that sort of meta awareness, I suppose, around what your thoughts are, what your desires are in Buddhist terms, or your preferences as far as the C matrix goes, and trying to figure out like what are those about? What am I going for? Do you have certain things that you want that you know you shouldn't want, and like trying to overcome those. Yeah, I think a lot of it involves like practicing one's attention. That is, I guess, precision optimization, like trying to like certain and certain signals that you're receiving, and instead switching your attention to others that might actually help you realize your new preferences, as opposed to maybe whatever led you to the negative habit before or something. And but with Buddhism, you have this notion of like a desire being kind of endless, right? And so like it can, kind of take you over if in the extreme. And I'm not sure where that lies as far as trying to use POMDP to model that as a process or something goes, but yeah, it's all very interesting. So I kind of just wanted to chime in on that bit.
Yeah. Like, just to connect the references a little bit in the textbook, here is that kind of figure you alluded to, 5-4, with the seesaw or the continuum between the total pass through of habit, defined however, and then the total sharpening to an arbitrary function. Which function? That's life/modeling. But this arbitrarily defined one, such that any sharpening we can fit within this framework. It doesn't even have to be one that is created by the modeler. That's why it's a descriptive view from the outside. And then here in the Sanford-Smith 21 paper, livestream 28, this kind of demonstrated the plausibility in the scheme for nested awarenesses, because just having attention or a bias filter of one depth is just like sharpens out, let's just say, edges from a static image. So successive layers of bias, signal to noise, could pull out edges or hallucinate them. But here it kind of pointed towards the ability that there could be awareness of awareness and this sort of more nuanced view on phenomenology, which could be understood, just could be whimsical, could be different culture, could be different individuals, just to show that it could be created in terms of this broader topic of regimes of attention as internal action as covert action. So using the same apparatus that's used for the overt action and like the planning where to walk, turning that to apply to potentially sequences of attentions. Ajit?
Yeah, so I had a different question not related to sort of meditation, so it's a little different, but
I'll go for it.
okay. I was just wondering, like, how exactly is sort of I guess like free will and measurement independence sort of, how's that related to like the free energy principle and active inference? Like, do behaviors follow like certain attractor states at certain times? And does that mean that like when you're taking a measurement of something, the choice between that measurement is actually like the choice between that measurement is statistically dependent with sort of like you kind of like if you're going to pick, between A and B, was that choice sort of determined if sort of, our decisions themselves follow sort of this principle of least action with like the free energy principle and all of that. So
Yeah,
I was just wondering, like, how is free will sort of formalized in active inference?
big question. Just so that a few other people can ask. Here's the shortest answer. Look it up in this coda. There's been a little bit of discussion on it. People have come down hard on one side or the other. People have put their professional careers on the line, one side or the other. Science shows this, science shows that. That's how I see that debate largely at this point.
So active inference doesn't actually like tell us, it doesn't lean towards one side as of yet, or
it doesn't have a system that it's based upon other than historically, but it doesn't have a system indicated. So it's expressionless about topics like the relevance of a given thing in a given situation for a given thing. It's multiple layers of productivity by the modeler and the contextualizer before that's even a complete sentence. So I think it's just cart and horse or something like that, but understandable and topically associated and historically associated.
Okay.
But we should continue to talk, read the coda and write or add more. And obviously it's an ongoing discussion. So I'm not saying it's permanently one way or the other. I'm just saying that you will find Discord messages and coda and transcripts of people vehemently believing both things within the last 2 months.
Okay.
Yeah. Everyone who wants to, how about just a closing round of thoughts on this, like first discussion on 10? So Bronwyn, then Magdalena, then anyone else.
Just very quickly, in terms of active inference going forward, you discussed it a little bit before in terms of what, sort of, here's the book in 2022, what happens in the future. I just wonder, it seems to me that from very different areas in life, people get their teeth, they hear about active inference and they get their teeth into it, and it's really hard to let it go. Like, it's like a dog with a bone. And I can't see how it can do anything other than evolve and become not denser but sparser in a way, a much more simple theory to be able to understand sentient behavior. I just wonder what people think about that and what their view on the future of active inference is. I mean, for me, it's something I haven't been able to let go of, and it just raises more questions day after day. So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, everyone can give a closing thought on that or whatever they want.
Yeah, my closing thought is that I first want to learn active inference really well. I want to understand it fully. I think it has a lot of promise, and every day I do a little bit of translation into the scientific questions that I'm working on. But I feel the same way you do. I just feel like this is just the beginning of a very long journey. It's going to take a lot of work. Sorry about that.
Any other closing thoughts on 10 or
Yeah, I think active inference is rather huge in this in the context of chapter 10 presenting the theory as a broad unified theory. I think it's going to go in many directions for whoever wants to start modeling in that direction. I myself discovered active inference like just a kind of hobbyist interest in psychoanalysis, and then I found the work of Mark Solms in neuropsychoanalysis, and then one thing led to another, and here I am wanting to read Karl Friston's work instead, almost, and seeing how this is being applied in fields as diverse as psychiatry to robotics. So yeah, I think it really, I'm more interested in seeing what kind of empirical work, like what kind of direct applications people carry out with this theory, and I think that'll probably end up shaping the field even more. Closing thought.
yeah, awesome. Ismail, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, today we speak about Daniel Dennett and Buddhism. I think one thing is common between Daniel Dennett and Buddhism. Both of them deny self. In the meditation, almost you will lose the self. And Daniel Dennett introduced self is like a school. For example, after 20 years in the school, everything will be changed, like teacher, students, bench, everything. Just they have same name. And this general model is, I think, exactly whole iguana. This don't look, don't suppose self. This active inference make general model for artificial intelligence and people brain and everything generative, not with some abstract idea. I think so.
Thank you. I think that's a super important point about how it's purely synthetic. And that is being explored more recently. So, however satisfied and excited we were previously, it continues to develop. And as with all of our discussions, this one probably opens up more questions than not. But these were all really great points. Chapter 10's kind of epic, but it's also like symbolic, and it is where we jump out. You know, we're going to close this meeting. We're going to close that book, and then you do something next. So that's really where it like breaks the fourth wall, breaks the fifth wall. All these like interesting dynamics of our engagement with it and all the fun things we get to do in textbook group. Yeah, though, we'll have another discussion next week, earlier. Then this time in 2 weeks, we will talk about projects or future textbook groups. Right now, already this form, yeah, is accurate. So you can fill out the form. You can give any other information. But other than that, we're just kind of chilling, cruising down the end of the year. Last few scheduled live streams. Have a quiet December, then come back in 24. Anyone's welcome to be a facilitator for a textbook group, or we can explore like other things. So, thank you. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Daniel.